Hey, right, modifications to motorcycles to improve safety, comfort, handling and performance. Now, I know there are a lot of videos about this on YouTube. I've not watched any of them, but what I have done is I've gone online to some of the bigger motorcycle publications just to see what their top 5 lists are, you know, the sort of first 5 modifications that people usually make to the motorcycles to enhance them. And actually I was quite surprised by some of these sort of 5 item lists because they didn't contain some of the things that I would consider essential, although there were some common denominators obviously. And so I thought it's my turn to make a video on this subject. Now there are 5 modifications that I'm going to talk about in this video. Number 1 being sort of the first modification that I normally make to a motorcycle, and number 5 being one of the last of the 5 that I make to the motorcycle. Now that doesn't mean that number 5 is the last modification you can make. Obviously it can go a lot further than that. But these are generally the first 5 modifications that I make that I consider work for me. So I'm going to count down from number 5 down to number 1. The last 2 will be quite surprising, I think, for a lot of people. Certainly none of the other lists mentioned them. But they are generally the first thing that I do, literally within minutes or hours of me taking delivery of a bike. And they don't cost a penny, so stick around to the end for those. Right, exhaust systems. Of these 5, changing the exhaust for something a little better flowing, free flowing, is usually a modification I like to make to all my bikes. In fact, I don't think there's a bike I own that I haven't done this to. And I think this is probably one of the most contentious modifications, if I'm honest. It seems to cause more online arguments than just about any other subject. So let's get this bit out of the way. First of all, legalities. Yes, in some geographical locations, the UK being one of them, it can be illegal to put an aftermarket exhaust system on your motorcycle for use on the road. And indeed, it may require the removal of the catalytic converter. Now, sometimes the catalytic converter is separate, so the choice is yours whether you remove it or not. Sometimes it's actually held within the silencer construction and the downpipe, so you'll have often 2 catalytic converters in that case, a primary and a secondary. And just putting a new set of mufflers on may just require removal of the secondary catalytic converter. I prefer, if they're available, to fit a complete free flow exhaust system onto the bike to replace all the gubbins that were already there. Modern motorcycles, due to emissions regulations, have been absolutely strangled to within an inch of their lives. Now, if you go online and search for what I'm about to say, it will tell you the exact opposite of what I personally have discovered over many years of experimenting with exhaust systems on motorcycles. And I'll make a point of saying these are exhaust systems that have been built by reputable, responsible companies that have actually taken the trouble to develop a proper exhaust for the bike in question, not some generic Asian product that is basically just a copy of something from the ancient past made as cheaply as possible without any consideration for the parameters that the vehicle needs to work around. There is a big difference where exhaust systems are concerned. You buy cheap, the chances are you are buying crap, and they're easy to spot because there will be a dozen other brands turning out exactly the same product with a different brand name on it. To meet the emissions regulations, modern exhaust systems, stock modern exhaust systems, tend to be very restrictive because the exhaust gases have to be forced through a maze of filters and baffles which require power, and that power comes from the engine. Instead of the engine putting that power to your back wheel through the gearbox, it's wasting some of that energy just through the action of trying to get rid of the exhaust fumes. And catalytic converters are an exercise in diminishing returns. The older they get, the more clogged they become, so the more power they sap, until eventually they have to be replaced. And because of this restriction, they also tend to build up heat. The engine will generally retain more heat than it would without the catalytic converter. Now, my personal findings after fitting a free flow exhaust system to a motorcycle, having removed the catalytic converter as well, is that the engine becomes more responsive, it becomes less susceptible to overheating in hot weather, and what always flouts the information you'll get online, fuel consumption almost always, in fact I can't think of an occasion when it hasn't, fuel consumption always goes down to a tune of at least 10 miles per tank of fuel, bearing in mind most of these bikes don't have big tanks, which over the years is going to represent a big saving in fuel costs. It doesn't necessarily make the engine more powerful, but it does make it more responsive. So you tend to use less throttle, hence less fuel, for the same amount of sort of acceleration and performance that you're demanding from your bike. Now, noise levels, a lot of people complain about this, and again, I'm talking about properly engineered exhaust systems from reputable companies. Generally speaking, I did some tests with a decibel meter in the early days of this channel, going back 8 years ago, where I demonstrated quite clearly that swapping these pipes often doesn't increase the actual decibel output of the exhaust system, but what it does do is change the tone. And I can attest categorically that all of these bikes have been through MOTs over the years, and never has any one of them been given an advisory or a failure based on these exhaust systems. Right, so exhaust modifications have enabled the bike to breathe out properly, but stock air filters tend to be very restrictive. They're made from a sort of a filter paper, which again is an exercise in diminishing returns. They're very restrictive when they're new, and the more used, the more clogged they become, and so the more restrictive they become. You know, we all know if you tried running around with a paper bag on your head, you would soon find it difficult to breathe, and it would, you know, damage your performance. Free flow air filters and free flow exhaust systems redress the balance where this is concerned. It allows the bike to breathe in and breathe out easily, releasing power from the engine. Now again, I do hear a lot of criticism and concern about free flow air filters in that they do allow dirt into your engine and cause excessive engine wear. I've never found that to be the case. I can't really find any examples that categorically prove that to be the case. At the end of the day, these are very clever little pieces of engineering that allow the motor to breathe in freely whilst trapping any sort of debris that is likely to cause damage. They are very good at what they do, and they don't clog. Now, they are expensive, but they are serviceable in that they can be cleaned and kept for many, many thousands of miles, whereas obviously your original air filter will probably have to be replaced at 10 or 20,000 miles. Long term, they do pay for themselves, they're very effective, and of all the lists that I mentioned earlier on that I went through, these two particular modifications are the most common modifications that most motorcyclists make to their bikes in the early days of ownership. They appeared on every single list, and so did this next one. Number 3, suspension. Now, there are suspensions responsible for sort of two main aspects of riding a motorcycle. One is to keep the motorcycle in check so that it remains stable in most eventualities on the road. It's responsible for maintaining the handling of the motorcycle. The other function, of course, is to make the rider as comfortable as possible, because an uncomfortable ride brings on early onset of fatigue, which is dangerous. So good suspension not only enhances comfort and handling, it's a safety feature. Now, most motorcycle manufacturers have to build the bikes down to a price to make them affordable, and unfortunately one of the biggest compromises almost always seems to be the suspension. Now, you can get awful front forks, but generally speaking they're okay, they're serviceable. It's the rear suspension that is often the problem for most people. Now, sometimes it's the quality of the suspension unit, but it's not always the quality. The biggest issue can often be the lack of adjustability. They'll almost always have the ability to adjust preload, but they don't have the ability to adjust damping, and that can make a big difference to handling and rider comfort, because we're all different, we all weigh different amounts. Some of us carry pillions, some of us don't. And it all makes a big difference to be able to set that suspension up to work correctly in every eventuality. And stock shocks obviously, tend to fall short in that respect. I've often heard it mooted that manufacturers will often spend between £5 and £10 per shock absorber for a motorcycle. Now, I don't know strictly whether that's true, but I can well believe it. So if you're going to replace those shocks, you need to replace them with something that is superior. And again, this comes down to choosing a reputable company that has done the proper development, that has, the experience in shock manufacture to provide you with something which is actually an improvement and not just a sideways step, or even a downgrade, as is often the case with some sort of products on the market. There is, it has to be said, a huge variation in price, quality and specification in aftermarket shock absorbers. You can easily spend close to £1,000 for, high-end track shocks, but you don't need to go that far. Unless, of course, you really want to, the choice is yours, but a couple of £100 will buy you a far superior set of shock absorbers with enough adjustability to tune the suspension to your taste and needs. A good set of aftermarket shocks won't just make the bike more comfortable, they will make it handle better, they will make it more responsive, they will give you a better feel for the road, and they will enhance safety. Right, on to number 2, and this one won't cost you anything. Well, it doesn't have to cost you anything. Motorcycle control levers. Now, when you buy a new bike, or a second-hand bike for that matter, these will often be just set up in a generic position, which might not suit you. Again, we're all different heights, we all have different arm lengths, we all have different preferences. Now, at the factory, or when the bike is assembled at the dealership, the mechanics responsible will set the levers up to their preferences, which might be very different to yours. Now, I personally have found this to be the case, especially as a younger rider, and I still get it quite regularly from viewers. They find that they're getting pains in the hands or the wrists or the forearms, or it could be other parts of the body. What they tend to do is they adapt to the situation, the way the levers are set up, rather than setting the levers up to work optimally for them, and this introduces discomfort. It can hinder your ability to use the clutch or the brake. And I remember owning one bike in the dim and distant past that caused terrible pain between my shoulder blades, and I eventually discovered that I was having to alter my seating position in order to be able to sort of crouch down to effectively operate the levers. And when I changed the position of the levers, it got rid of that pain altogether. Now, this is a modification because you're modifying the position of the levers as opposed to how they were set up at the factory or at the dealership. And just by spinning the collar that actually holds the lever assembly onto your handlebars, sometimes only by a millimetre or two, you're altering the angle of that lever so that it's more comfortable for you. And once you've got it right and you've got it set up for you, you found that it enhances your ability to operate the clutch and the brake. Sometimes it even improves the visibility in the mirrors if they're attached to the same collar. And it makes the bike safer and more comfortable to ride. A lot of people do just consider that the lever angle has to be left as it is, and it really doesn't. You should adjust these to make sure that they work properly for you. Now, adjustable levers, a lot of bikes don't come with adjustable levers, some do. Again, this is something that you need to pay attention to. Now, for bikes that come with adjustable levers, it's important that you do adjust them to suit the span and, obviously the preferences that you have with your hands. But it is important that you get a good fit for action with your levers. So if they don't come with them and you're not getting on with the levers, don't just manage. Get yourself a set of adjustable levers. Generally speaking, you can get them quite cheaply. Obviously, the higher the quality, the more they're going to cost. The choice is yours. But comfortable, easy operation of your control levers for safety as well as comfort is essential. Excruciating pain in your clutch hand is something that we've all experienced over the years through ill-fitting or ill-adjusted levers. So it's essential that you get this part right. Alter your levers when you first get the bike to suit you. Do some miles on it. And if you find that the span doesn't suit you, get yourself some adjustable levers so you can make the necessary adjustments. I know this might sound obvious to a lot of you, but seriously, I've had conversations with people that were on the verge of selling the bikes because of problems with levers, because it just hadn't occurred to them that it's something they can do something about. Generally speaking, this is something I address within hours of receiving a new motorcycle. I can't emphasise how important it is, but this is not the first thing that I check and adjust if necessary when I get a new bike. Moving on to number 1, the tyres. Actually, I think tyres are the most contentious subject, probably even more contentious than exhaust systems. Motorcycle tyres are the most crucial components of any motorcycle. There's just 2 hoops of rubber that are responsible for your safety on every ride. They're responsible for transferring the power from the engine to the road to provide forward motion. They're responsible for steering. They're responsible for sticking you to the road so that you don't slide off when you go around a bend. And they also have a huge bearing on fuel economy. But for a lot of riders, they're also the most ignored and neglected component on the motorcycles. And with surprising regularity, I get emails or comments from viewers that have just owned a motorcycle for a few days and they think they've got to change the tyres because they're not performing how they want them to. Now, in a perfect world, you would expect that when you get a motorcycle from a dealer, especially a new motorcycle, the tyre pressures should be set correctly as per the manufacturer's instructions. But believe it or not, they are often under pressure. Sometimes they're over pressure. And that can have a serious negative effect on a motorcycle. Now, when a motorcycle's new, you've got to scrub the tyres in anyway. It usually takes about 100 miles to wear a tyre in. But a lot of people just assume that the tyre pressures will be correct. Now, I reckon that in most cases these bikes leave the factory with the correct tyre pressures, but by the time they get to you, especially if the PDI hasn't checked them, which, let's face it, PDIs at dealerships are not as reliable as they used to be, they can often be significantly underinflated, and there's a couple of reasons for this. One is the passage of time. The bike could have been in transit and in storage for months before it's finally been delivered to you, and you've got a natural loss of air in any tyre, which could be responsible for it being underinflated. The other thing to take into consideration is if that bike was built or PDI'd in a hot ambient temperature and you've got the bike on a cooler day, the tyre pressures could have dropped significantly. Tyre pressure and ambient temperature are both sort of intricately connected to each other. Your tyre pressure can drop or increase from day to day depending what the ambient temperatures are. And a lot of motorcycles are built in hot countries. This is just something to bear in mind. It's important to check your tyre pressures as soon as you receive the bike. Now, I know for a fact that probably 80% of the bikes I've ever taken delivery of have had low pressures, and this will result in sloppy handling, higher fuel consumption because it creates more rolling resistance, and ultimately premature tyre wear. Just as an example, over the years I've had a lot of motorcycling friends who considered, if there was air in the tyre, that's good enough. And as far as they were concerned, it was the responsibility of the dealership when the bikes went in for service to ensure that the tyre pressures were correct. Whether they're actually checked during a service or not, I don't know. Now, one particular acquaintance of mine, sort of many years ago, he was literally going through a back tyre on his motorcycle every 17 to 1900 miles. These rear tyres were wearing out prematurely, and I think it was on his third rear tyre in a year since he got the bike. Now, he was one of these people who never checked his tyre pressures. He expected them to be correct when the tyre was fitted, and he expected them to stay inflated to the correct parameters until it was ready for its next service. And I suggested that this might be an issue to him, but he wasn't having any of it. And eventually he complained to the tyre manufacturer, and I can't remember who it was now. It's Michelin or someone like that, a big tyre company. And they agreed to examine the last tyre that it had replaced to see what the issue was. And sure enough, a couple of weeks later, he got a letter along with a report demonstrating that the tyre had been forensically examined and that the abnormal wear was due to underinflation. He'd wrecked his tyre because he'd not kept an eye on the tyre pressures. And I say, tyre pressures, they can often be underinflated when you take delivery of your bike. And my theory is that this is one of the prime reasons that people dislike tyres on new bikes. Within a few hundred or a couple of thousand miles, the calling foul of the tyres. Yet, in a lot of cases, and I know because I've spoken to some of them by email and by other means, they've never checked the tyre pressure in all the time they've had the bike. So, this is the first modification that you should do whenever you get a motorcycle, whether it be second hand or new. Check your tyre pressures and reinflate them, or let a little bit of air out if they're overinflated, to the correct specifications before you even take your first ride. And continue to check them regularly. I'm sure a lot of people will be far happier with the tyres if they just followed that rule. Right, once again, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and my other videos, and in doing so helping to support this channel. I hope you found this video useful. I do try my best. Now, you can show your appreciation by leaving a like and subscribing to the channel if you're not already a subscriber. There are other ways of showing your appreciation via my Patreon page, PayPal donations, or via the Super Thanks button down below. Not essential, but much appreciated. I am, of course, going to be back next week, so until then, please ride safely, and I'll see you soon.